Hello everyone, I'm Firdaus and today I'm here with another Get Clued Up for this session. So today we are going to talk about our campaign and our decolonization work. So we have Maxine with us who will inform us more about decolonization. So I'm going to introduce Maxine with you. So Maxine, this stage is yours.
Thank you so much. It is really, really exciting to be with you all today. I'm just going to share my screen. Fantastic. So yes, as Fadis has said, my name is Maxine and I'm super excited to be with you today. To offer a little bit of background, I have a law degree from SOAS, which is a neighbouring university not too far, and I'm currently studying a master's degree in international social and public policy at the London School of Economics. So also still based in London. During my final year of my undergraduate degree, I was commissioned by my widening participation department to launch a student-led program called Bridging the Gap. Bridging the Gap addressed the racial attainment gap, which is something we're going to discuss, which was in operation at SOAS's law department. And we did this through a mentoring scheme, through panel discussions, and through writing an extensive report on reform ideas for the existing anti-racism strategy. 18 months on from that work, the department was able to boast a 0% attainment gap for that academic year. So it was a really exciting project with lots of people contributing to it. Following my undergraduate degree, I served as the co-president Democracy and Education at SOAS Students' Union. So student unions are very close to my heart and I'm really glad to be here today. And that pretty much takes us up until now. So as I mentioned, I'm back in education, studying for my master's and working freelance as a public speaker, trying to support universities and professionals to embody anti-racism. And through this work, I've had the opportunity to speak for Westminster Briefing, Times Higher Education, and have contributed to a Guardian article. So I'm really glad to say that I've had the opportunity to hear from quite a few different voices and different stakeholders in these conversations. And I hope that helps me to bring you some good information today. I want to thank those of you who are here for attending today's session, and I'm hopeful that this is going to be a positive space where we can learn together, think together, with the aim of making London South Bank as unified and anti-racist as we can possibly be. And it's my hope that this information will encourage your student community to organise and mobilise around the issues of anti-racism and decolonizing. We're going to be talking about the ways that we knowingly and unknowingly contribute to inequalities and hierarchies. And while this conversation is mostly about systems, we're also going to take some time to think about how we as individuals can contribute and benefit from some of these systems which have existed for centuries. So it's also always useful to start with an outline of the session. And first of all, we're going to discuss what decolonizing is and what decolonizing is not. And that's going to mean challenging some of the misconceptions to hopefully pave the way for some shared foundations. In the second section, we're going to explore how colonial values and racist values are really ingrained in the education system and what it means to decolonize education, where we should be looking and what conversations we could be having around this. Lastly, we're going to discuss the role of the student movement and us as student stakeholders in contributing to strategies and holding universities to account regarding decolonizing processes. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to post them to the YouTube stream or on Facebook, because I would love to answer them. We're going to leave a little bit of time at the end to answer any questions that have arisen. So if you have any, please do feel free to leave them to prompt me and Fadus's conversation later on. So even though it seems backward or in reverse order, we're going to start with what decolonizing is not. We're going to bust some myths. And unfortunately, when decolonizing is brought to the fore or raised as an agenda item or a topic of conversation, universities can be quite quick to try and find an answer straight away. And that can lead to us creating tick box exercises or engaging in what we believe would be helpful without really interrogating the issue. And the first things that universities tend to do is to address the reading lists, add 2 or 3 more writers and authors from racialized communities, or to add 1 week to your module, which covers whatever the central topic is in relation to race. And after that, people will very quickly assert that they have decolonized their curriculum and that they are good to go. I will start by saying, unfortunately, that is not enough. So if decolonizing is not just reading lists, what is decolonizing? In my mind, the way I tend to frame decolonizing is as a process. It's a process of righting historical wrongs, of undoing centuries of harm, of challenging established norms, and reimagining a future grounded in liberation. However, in a recent conversation with a friend, he was sharing his thoughts on what decolonizing is, and he was saying to me that as it stands, decolonizing is less of a process and more of a concept. He was saying to me that we haven't quite reached the stage in the discourse where we're really seeing action being taken. And though we aspire to get there, we're currently in thinking and planning stages. So decolonizing is an idea, it's a vision for the future, it's something that we are calling for, lobbying for and demanding. But it's also, I would argue at the same time or subsequently too, a process of engaging with where we are and aiming towards a different future. So where does decolonizing sit and what does it address? I think the reason it can be so difficult to comprehend is because colonialism exists at so many different levels, and therefore what it means to decolonize also means interrogating different levels of interaction. It requires us to look at the personal level, to think about what language we use, what subconscious or conscious prejudices affect my interpersonal relationships, the use of the way that I choose to navigate the world and how I'm able to navigate the world, the privileges or the disadvantages that I face or benefit from. It exists at the local level. We have to ask ourselves questions of how do these debates play out in my vicinity? So if I see people being mistreated in spaces that aren't necessarily my home, but are close to me, spaces like the GP, places like local shops, places like bus stops that are part of my community living, but aren't necessarily my personal space, how do I engage with those issues? How do I engage with those situations? Do I actively participate? Do I watch from afar? Do I feel able to speak on issues of racism that I might see in my local area? It exists at the national level, and it asks us to really question some of the values that underpin public discourse and public debates. And it's something that also exists at the international level. It's something which we could interrogate existing at the UN level or in the International Criminal Court. And so during this talk, because the framing and the spectrum of this talk is focused on decolonizing education, we're going to be focused on the interpersonal level, so ourselves, and also the local level. And we'll be looking at our universities and institutions as part of our local environment. But it is worth mentioning and keeping in our minds that this is something that exists at all of these levels, and these levels are related. So one of the most important aspects of decolonizing is about the recognition of important voices and labor. And so we're going to take a minute to learn from some of the current and important voices in these conversations to deepen our understanding of what decolonizing is. So Professor David Olusoga, OBE, in a recent Minerva talk, framed decolonizing, and most specifically reparations, as a matter of restorative justice. Arguably, he says universities are doing this on their own while the national level has been slow to respond. And he argues that universities are being prompted to look at how they obtain their wealth, to reinvest in communities that have historically been harmed by this. Professor Akosia Adamako Ampofo argues or understands decolonizing as the diagnosis of Western culture's impact, especially its racialized philosophical underpinnings, institutions, norms, values, and practices, and to look at the way that these norms, values, institutions have impacted the lives of minorities and other cultures. These were often imposed violently, and she talks about us offering, after a diagnosis, a prognosis of how we can experience liberty, healing, and restoration for the colonized. I feel like it's always helpful to refer back to the dictionary, and maybe that is to do with my role and position in academia, but Cambridge Dictionary defines the word decolonize to mean making a country that was previously a colony politically independent to get rid of colonies. And the reason I've included that is because it speaks to the continuation of this conversation of decolonizing to the relationship of independence movements that we saw towards the end of the 20th century. So these speakers are Professor David Olusoga and Professor Akosia Adamako are talking about a West African context, but it's also really important that we consider how this is relevant for other racialized groups and people, communities. And so I want to take a moment to tap into some words from an activist who engages in the Australian context and looks at the treatment and history of Indigenous people. And so we're just going to take a minute to listen to this video by the Center Melbourne as part of their Big World Up Close performance series. Thank you.
Decolonization means to me accountability, an understanding of what was and what needs to be, and also absolutely a recentering back to the First Peoples Law, and also for every person who's actually had anything stolen from them through colonization worldwide, to acknowledge that, to sit with it, and then to, man, go get it, to feel absolutely in their light, seen and heard doing their stuff. I think decolonization feels like freedom. It feels like things being put right. It feels gentle. It feels loving. It feels all-encompassing, whole, rather than having to be a fraction of yourself, only parts of yourself being seen and heard. It's just like full body, free-flowing creativity. And to get back there is an incredible internal journey. I think it first has to be internal. Things come to mind like accountability, power, black solidarity, connection, First Peoples globally, that connection from these words that were given to us like South Africa, Palestine, and Australia, to get back and back and back and back and back and all the way back, to be able to look forward, but to always have that feeling of what came before, never to cut that root at any point or to cut that plant at any point, to actually have it going like this the entire time, and to like live and dream and love in the multiplicity and the contradiction and the fullness of that. You have to know that we're still living in a colonized space, that our education is still colonized, that our institutions are still colonized, that the law, that criminality, that even the supermarkets we go to are still colonized. You have to know what we're in. Somebody said we were in post-truth, but we're in pre-truth because we haven't got to truth yet, right?
And so I just wanted to briefly stop there to make sure that I'm drawing in some of the other contexts which this conversation is pertinent to. And so Candy Boa's speaking here is so powerful. And I will include a link so that people can find it again. But I just wanted to take this moment to recognize that this conversation, in the way that I engage with it, tends to center around African experiences and Black experiences, but it's not exclusive to that. It's about drawing in voices from Indigenous communities, from Asian communities, particularly in the UK context, South Asian communities. And there is a relevance of all of that history and those different histories to this conversation. So if we're to just take a moment and pause on what some of the similarities between this video is and the previous quotes, some of the themes of decolonizing, I would argue, include accountability, healing, freedom, liberation, righting historical wrongs, acceptance rather than tolerance of difference, and an acknowledgement and recognition of the past. And to carry on with this conversation, we're going to just take a moment to think about what this means and what some of these ideas mean for ourselves on the day-to-day basis. And so, as you see here, a number of what I will say are key terms in anti-racist discourse. And hopefully some of these terms will be familiar to you because they appear in the news and in higher education discourse and in policy and in activist spaces. And so I want us to pause to interrogate some of this language and see what we can learn from it and what we can try to, what we can challenge and what can be improved on. So just to start at the beginning, I'm going to start with BAME and BME. And these are the terms most commonly used in terms of addressing anti-racism in higher education. They're policy terms, and BAME stands for Black and Asian Minority Ethnic, and BME stands for Black Minority Ethnic. They both have a similar history and trajectory, but BAME speaks to actively recognizing Asian, particularly in the British context, South Asian communities who are not expressly recognized in the BME term. Both of these terms are highly criticized for being clinical, to failing to represent the communities that they claim to describe, and for causing erasure. The way that we know that this language isn't necessarily the way people describe themselves is because a lot of the time, if you're a person, as I was, who would be captured by these brackets, often you have to be told what this language means, what the acronym is, and what it stands for. And as language goes, if you're imposing a label on somebody and you have to explain what that label means, the likelihood is it's not self-ascribed, it's ascribed by an external party. And I think that's something that's really important for us to concentrate in this whole conversation is, where's the ownership? Who owns the language? Who chooses the language? Is it the people that are being ascribed it, or is this ownership coming from elsewhere? Similar to this idea of kind of grouping together, a criticism arises, and I mentioned it in the term erasure, but the grouping together of vastly different experiences. So, for example, even the way that different groups experience racism or racialization feels different, looks different, sounds different. The way that stereotypes operate, the way that people are met in the street or in the local space, in the way that people are treated in interpersonal relationships are different. And therefore, the way that we need to address this racism is also different. But by grouping together huge swathes of people and numerous communities, we can lose that nuance and that detail. And so that criticism also arises with the term POC, which stands for people of color, and also for the term non-white people, which again is the idea of everybody who doesn't identify as being white. So the term that I tend to use most frequently is racialized communities, and it's still not perfect, but it aims to recognize the fact that racial identities and ethnic identities are more a part of our social conditioning than they are a natural order. And so historically, there were arguments that human beings from different races are fundamentally different based on biological characteristics. And that argument has been largely dismissed and is not really reputable anymore. But yet still, the associated stereotypes and assumptions on character seem to persist. And so the term racialized communities tends to, or attempts to, recognize that process of a person being socialized into what their race means. So I've also included Black communities and South Asian communities because in our British context, when we're talking about home students, that's mostly the communities that we are referring to. And you'll find 9 times out of 10 that that's the language people choose to describe themselves. And so as far as we can, it's important that we try to center the language that people choose for themselves. I've also included people of the global majority and BIPOC, BIPOC, because they speak to some of the increasing lines and movements of activism to consider what language we can use that is more empowering. So people of the global majority tries to build a relationship between people in the diaspora in the global north, and the fact that there's a relationship, a historical relationship, a cultural relationship potentially to another place, and people of color or people from racialized communities tend to be only minorities in the global north. And so it speaks to that. BIPOC is a term that is growing out of the American and Canadian context. It stands for Black and Indigenous people of color, and it particularly highlights the Black communities and Indigenous communities, which are particularly pertinent conversations in those contexts. And the reason it draws out Black is because of the term on the far right, anti-Blackness, which speaks to particular types of racism which aren't experienced generally or uniformly by people from racialized backgrounds, but particularly target people with darker skin or from Black backgrounds. And so it's important in our conversation here as well that we recognize there are differences in the way that racism happens, and it's important that we also are clear on when we're talking about racism, what types of racism, and when we're talking about anti-Blackness. So this was a lot of information. These are a lot of terms. The point I'm trying to make here, and far be it from me to say which terms are right and which terms are wrong, but my point is that we need to problematize, challenge, and engage with the language that we use. We need to think about what the language that we use means, what the connotations are, what the impacts of using it are, and not take this language and these words as a given. So I've spoken a lot about anti-racism, and it raises the important question of what is the relationship between anti-racism and decolonizing? And when I asked myself this question, when I was engaging and preparing the PowerPoint, I really had to stop to think. The way that I would understand the relationship between anti-racism and decolonizing requires us first to engage with what colonialism was and how it operated. Colonialism was an economic system, a political system, a social system. And it was created and upheld by creating certain values that centered the person as the worker, the idea of capitalism and the idea of making money, and all of these different ideas. And so when we're trying to decolonize, we're trying to uproot the whole tree of all of those values of what colonialism established and to undo the harm that's been caused. So decolonizing is uprooting the whole tree. But the thing is, the tree had fruit, and racism is one fruit, and therefore one fruit among many. Other fruits of colonialism, as I'll put it, might include ableism, homophobia, sexism, individualism. And so when we're targeting anti-racism, we're targeting a symptom. When we're doing anti-racism, we're targeting racism, which is a symptom. When we're doing decolonizing, we're uprooting the whole rotten tree. We're trying to address and cure the cause. And hopefully that provides some kind of clarity to the difference between those two conversations. If we're talking about decolonizing, it's not just about race. It's also about disability justice. It's also about gender equality. It's also about homophobia, transphobia, and to make sure that those in our society are able to live their lives as they see fit and have the freedom to make choices. So before we move on to section 2, which looks at decolonizing academia, I just want to pause on some of the criticisms, or one of the criticisms of decolonizing. Decolonizing is a critique of colonialism and what we live in now, neocolonialism. It pushes for a society that counters and draws away from historic oppression. However, there is a valid argument which holds decolonizing tells us what we don't want, but does it actually tell us what we do want? In response to this, I would say that decolonizing pushes us to dream about the future we want to design. And while I do concede the point that I'm not 100% sure on what that future looks like, which is important to me as a policy student, there is time to see where this movement takes us. Decolonizing isn't asserting a perfect vision. What it's saying is that in order for us to design our future, we have to empower enough people with different backgrounds, different experiences, different histories to be free enough to contribute to the conversation of what our future looks like. And at the point when we're all liberated and we're all, operating on a level playing field, we'll be able to sit down and have this conversation. So perhaps then it would be fair to say decolonizing has it provides a transition support into the future we want to see from where we currently are. So From here, I want to move on to section 2, which talks about what decolonizing means for higher education. And I recognize that I've talked about decolonizing at such a big scale that it's now seeming very abstract, when actually you came to a talk called Decolonising the Curriculum and maybe want to hear more about that. So as we go on, we're going to engage with what decolonizing means or could mean for teaching and learning, what decolonizing could mean for research, and what decolonizing means for universities as companies and as operational institutions. So let's start with teaching and learning. This is where the first part, and I will come back to it, reading lists come back in. So I don't want in any way to dismiss that reading lists are completely irrelevant. They are important. They're highly important, in fact. If we're in a space to learn, what we learn is very pertinent. But in addition to that, it also, decolonizing asks us to question, what's the relationship in the classroom? What's the relationship between the teacher and the student? Are there dynamics of the teacher being the expert who imputes and imparts knowledge on an open recipient student? Or are we talking about spaces where everybody has knowledge and everybody has different knowledge? We're bringing in our histories and our experiences, and we're using those to interrogate information with a feeling of equal access. And so there's a few thinkers lots of thinkers really, who have challenged and engaged with what this space of the learning environment should look like and what it should feel like. And one of my favorites is Freire, who talks about co-producing learning environments. And effectively states that education should be a space that when people are learning, by the time they're finished, they should be able to articulate their problems. They should feel safe enough to propose solutions, and there shouldn't be a hierarchy between who has knowledge and who doesn't have knowledge. It's about recognizing that there are different types of knowledges, and we can all bring that into the space and interrogate, engage, and grow together. So if we change the way we conceive of education, so rather than me coming to my lecture for an expert to talk at me for 2 hours while I make notes, if we're moving towards a space where my questions are important and my thoughts are important and I'm able to challenge and engage with the limitations or the strengths, what does that mean for assessment? Are conventional exams and essays useful anymore? What if there are different types of sharing information that can be more accessible to people with different learning needs or different skill sets? What if I'm better at oral speaking? If I'm able to interrogate the information with the same rigor, does it matter if I make a PowerPoint or if I speak or if I create a film? And so there are increasingly conversations in higher education about how we can create more accessible and more appropriate assessment to recognize different types of education generally, broadly, and specifically decolonized education. So the last point, and this is a short one, it's also about how people, we as students and staff, navigate the learning space. Do people use terms like, it's obvious that, clearly? What does that say about the assumptions being made on the knowledge people are entering the room with? Does it exclude certain people? And this is something I often think about in my exams. I often see English idioms. And I say English, like English from the UK, idioms that I know exist in everyday life. What does that mean for an international student who might not be familiar with social idioms, who can speak English perfectly, academically, but might not know some of these idioms or recognize them and is now in a high pressure environment? Who does that exclude and who does it include? And so there are important questions for us to ask there. The next thing I want to talk about is the university as a space of a research production space. So research is about producing knowledge, and it's important for us to ask what that knowledge looks like and what it means. So this might mean us challenging perceptions of neutrality. Whenever we write in education, in higher education, we're encouraged to be perceived as neutral, to be calm, to be objective, rather than to be emotional or partial. But whose voice is perceived of as neutral and whose voice is perceived of as emotive or partial? Are we interrogating what this neutrality means, who it excludes, and most importantly, who it harms? And unfortunately, because of this perceived desire for neutrality, generational harms in academia have been perpetuated without being interrogated. So, for example, there are areas of science such as phrenology, which have historically very much contributed and provided the basis for and legitimacy of overtly racist laws, structures, processes. And that research at the time was perceived of as neutral. In hindsight, is it neutral, or is it highly charged and highly racist? How do we interrogate the way that our positionalities, all of our positionalities, that means that our identities, our experiences, how do those things influence what we perceive of as neutral and how we engage with information? We should be using our research to amplify silenced voices and not to speak for them. There's this huge issue we see, and we're talking about universities in the global north right now. We're talking about London South Bank and SOAS and LSE, the universities in the UK, who might be engaging with issues in other countries, particularly in the global south, but may enter these spaces as experts when researchers in those spaces aren't always able to access the same privileges, even in the academic field. So whose voice is recognized as having authority and whose voice doesn't count? And how do we make sure that our research amplifies voices rather than diminishes them? And so that's also something for universities to think about with international partnerships and the way that we engage in that type of research. The next thing I want to talk about, and I'll briefly pause on it, is about open science. And so there are movements in academia which are striving to try and improve these issues in practice. Open research tries to encourage a more democratized access to information. It tries to remove paywalls so that people in the general public can even access the research and engage in these conversations. And from there, we can have more interrogation and more replication in trials and experiments to try and produce the best quality knowledge. And so there are moves being made to try and make this a little bit stronger. So it's worth being aware of. The last point I want to pause on is universities as employers and increasingly as businesses. So as the marketization of higher education continues, universities do have the power, even within their own operations, to try and improve on the way that on decolonizing initiatives. So this can mean trying to improve hiring processes by using blind CVs. Blind CVs, a questionable term, but effectively aims to take out people's names to prevent or mitigate the chances of exclusion based on ethnic names, for example. So there was research that said that people with names that were overtly non-British would be less likely to receive callbacks. So by having a blind CV or a CV without your name on it, you might be able to mitigate some of that inequality. So those types of work, those types of initiatives. There are also questions about how we recognize staff who are undertaking additional work in the form of informal mentoring or supporting decolonizing initiatives. Is this work recognized? Is it championed? Is it supported? And does it contribute towards promotion opportunities? So that was loads of ideas of what decolonizing could mean for universities. And I think there's a lot for us to think about there on where we want our universities to start. We can't do it all at the same time, but we should be aiming to do as much of it as possible, and we should be making a concerted effort to try. But what is important for now, starting from today, how do we as students actually contribute to some of the conversations that are already happening? Because as I mentioned with open science, this is something that is very much happening in the academic field. This is something that a lot of students care about. But how do we make sure that our voices are being heard? So this third section is going to talk about the role of students in decolonizing universities. So in order for us to contribute to the conversations happening, we first have to understand the conversations that are happening. And while we're talking about decolonizing today, often these conversations about anti-racism are centered in an EDI context. So EDI stands for equality, diversity, and inclusion. I am a strong advocate of the argument that decolonizing and EDI are not the same thing. EDI seeks for equality, which is a good thing, which is about people being treated equally and being given fair opportunities. Decolonizing is about liberating people and helping people to achieve freedom. So what the final output looks like is slightly different. That being said, EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion work, still gives us a great opportunity to participate in some of these conversations. So in the university context, most of our universities will have, if not all, will have a widening participation department. And this department is a legal requirement, and it effectively works towards these kind of issues of making sure that we have more diverse classrooms, making sure that people are being supported to thrive. And they may also be supported by EDI individuals, people with EDI in their title or in their work remit, and also by EDI committees, which might include staff and will often have some kind of student representation, even if that's coming from your student union. And so it's really important here that we also consider that relationship between us as students and our student union as our representatives in these spaces. So what are all these words? These words, access, belonging, retention, attainment, and employment, are some of the words that are often used in the context of widening participation, EDI, to engage with some of the debates that we've been talking about previously. So, just briefly, I'm going to skim through these because they're all significant in their own right and worth knowing. But for the sake of our talk, we're rattling through a little bit today. Access is about understanding and who is in our classroom and what our cohorts look like. So are our classrooms mostly containing men or women or people who are from white backgrounds or people who are from racialized communities or people who are from well-off backgrounds and are richer or people who are from less well-off backgrounds? What can we read from our student makeup about who's being able to access the space, who's being invited to access the space? And this is a really important trend that we're seeing nationwide, which is that according to Universities UK and NUS research piece, which was published, I think, in 2019, Black students particularly, and for the NUS, Black is racialized communities, it's BAME, are overrepresented at universities generally, but underrepresented at the top universities. So what can we read from that? Who's able to access spaces? We can then talk about belonging, which is that how do people feel once they're on campus? Do people feel able to access mental health support or career support? Are they really getting the most help and support possible to thrive at universities? And this is particularly important during COVID because we've had this really quick move online without really having much time to integrate these kind of equality and diversity measures into our online operations. The next question is retention, and this asks us about dropout rates. So are students completing their degrees, or do we see higher dropout rates among students from racialized groups? Has your university or your department been engaging in exit interviews to better understand why people might drop out? And this last part, which is really close to my heart, is about whether we see people from racialized communities engaging in postgraduate study. Do people from different communities see themselves represented in academia and see the academic route as a legitimate option for their future? And sadly, too often the case is that the answer to that question is no. And so people from racialized communities might not even consider the option of continuing on to postgraduate study as masters or PhDs, not only because they don't see themselves there, but for those of us who might be considering it, the expense is often so overwhelming that it doesn't feel like a viable option. And so what are universities doing to also make sure that they're retaining people, not just to the end of their undergraduate, but into postgraduate study and beyond? The next is attainment or awarding, which speaks to how the grades that people end their qualification with. So do people end with top grades, which is statistically considered as 2-1s or first class? And unfortunately, again, disproportionately, students from racialized communities do not achieve those top grades. Not because of their own fault, not because of anything that they lack, but because of the way that our composition in higher education works, it's making it more difficult to access those top grades as a result of topics and debates like cultural capital. What do people come into the classroom with? What types of language are recognized? What type of phrasing is perceived of as formal and rigorous? And the situation is quite bad on this. Again, in that same report by the Universities UK and the NUS, the National Union of Students, it was found that there's a 13 percentage point disparity between white students and BAME students. And again, I've highlighted the issue with that conglomeration because there are subgroups within that BAME title that might perform better than this, or have a lower percentage point, or even outperform white students. But on average, the disparity is quite significant and something we need to be considering. And then the last point is employment. So you've got to uni, you've finished your degree, you've stayed on, you've managed to get to the end. But what does that degree mean about your future life chances? And again, this is something that universities are part of, even though it seems odd that you've left the university by that point, but it's still part of what is recognized as being part of the university's responsibility and work and contribution. So the reason that I stopped there is because in order for us to meaningfully contribute to conversations about anti-racism, about EDI, hopefully to draw in those issues of decolonizing, we have to understand what conversations the university is having. If we don't know what they're talking about in the committee spaces, in departments, we're not able to contribute to what needs and priorities we would like to see. So whenever I'm advertising or encouraging universities to engage with students, one of the first things that I always encourage universities to do, departments to do, is to engage with organic sites of organizing. Where are students already? Do you have successful ACS committees or decolonizing working groups, or maybe ISOC, that are organic spaces of organizing where students feel comfortable to speak and able to contribute to discussions on these issues? And again, there's a really important link here with the student union, because the way that we organize and discuss as students isn't necessarily the same way that the university might need that information to be packaged. So one of my favorite organizing spaces, which is why I mentioned it, was the ACS, and we had really important conversations. But what the EDI committee needs for the university is a report. And we didn't necessarily have a report because we'd engaged informally, we'd engaged at the end of pizza nights or at the end of movie screenings. And so there is a role of the student union in kind of collecting those ideas and being able to translate them in a way that the university is able to engage with. There's also a role of the university of being willing to be a little bit more flexible and being willing to hear students in the way that they speak, and seeing that as a priority. So that is just a sidebar about how we meaningfully contribute to these conversations, not just as members of a society, but as students generally. Perhaps you're not part of any of these societies, but there still need to be avenues for you to be able to contribute your views and to be heard in a meaningful and transformative way. So in case you are interested, because I think it is useful to know, universities do tend to publish their priorities and their work on these initiatives. So if you ever feel like Googling, you can Google your university's Access, Participation and Success Plan. You can Google their EDI strategy, and you might be able to find more information on what your university is prioritizing. See if it's something that you agree with, see if it's the areas you want to see them prioritizing, or see if there are other initiatives and priorities that you feel should be centered. I feel like it's important to say here that this isn't easy or accessible for everyone, and especially for groups from racialized communities where we're already at disadvantages and we're already having to push twice as hard to be able to engage and come out with top degrees. Maybe you don't have the capacity to contribute to some of these conversations. But if you do, there need to be avenues for you to be able to, and it's important that you know where those are. And so that's the question here, and the significant point is that whatever you have the capacity to do and to participate in, please do. Your labor is important and it's valued and valuable, and your voice is significant. So just to summarize that there, maximize your students' union. They often have an in into these conversations, which is useful for us to better understand the operations. Tap into existing societies and student groups. You don't necessarily have to make a whole new space to talk about these issues if there are spaces where these issues can already be discussed. That being said, if they don't exist, maybe this is something that's important to think about. Maybe it would be useful to make another society that addresses this and create space for this specifically. If you have the capacity, research EDI strategies, APS plans, and do your best to try and learn as much as possible so that you can make sure that your voice can be heard. And lastly, if you do have the capacity, and when you see your university is trying to create this consultative dynamic, participate. If you have the time to go, if you have the energy to go, it's worth going. This is a lot of work, and I recognize this is all a lot of work, so I thought I would also put in some cheat codes. And through my experience engaging with different universities, my own universities, engaging with student organizers at other universities, these are some of my top tips on how to avoid common pitfalls that most universities will go through. First of all, effective data collection is essential. You need to know what the picture looks like. Do you have an issue with retention? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Before you launch into a headlong plan of what to do about it, it's useful to have an image of what particular groups, not just all BAME. Is it Black Caribbean students or is it Bangladeshi students? And maybe neither of those groups. So you need to see where the issue is to be able to produce targeted solutions. So first thing, make sure that your universities are investing in effective data collection. 2, delegation and accountability. It's really important that this work is owned by a task force or a reputable and accountable individual who can be contacted, who can be challenged if deadlines are not met, who can be asked questions about the details of operation. And unfortunately, where universities can be a little bit reluctant to fund this work, it can end up operating on a voluntary scale. And what happens there is that students and staff from the backgrounds that are being negatively affected disproportionately carry the workload of having to then create the solutions, implement the solutions, monitor the solutions. And that is not just. So the idea of having successful delegation accountability makes sure that it's not just people from the affected backgrounds engaging in these conversations, but that we have an array and a broad representation of backgrounds contributing and implementing, but also that the work can be checked up on and progress can be made. The next is transformative participation by staff and students from racialized groups. So even though the work should not solely be left to students and staff from these groups, it's really important that there are spaces for students and staff who are affected by these issues to be able to speak freely, to share their experiences, to engage in collective and group healing, and that should be prioritized. The next is avoiding deficit models. All too quickly, the issues that we've talked about, from access, employability, retention, can be reduced to issues that students from racialized groups are lacking something inherently that we need to help them to get. And the start point of that conversation is highly problematic. We're not talking about individuals that lack something. We're talking about a global system which excludes certain voices and certain people. And the accumulation of that exclusion and discrimination from a young age can lead to difficulty in terms of these other issues in higher education. This is not in any way to do with any kind of lack that a student has. It speaks to structural oppression and structural inequalities, which we're deciding to solve. And the last point is put your money where your mouth is. If your university is genuinely intent on making these changes, it takes investment. We are undoing centuries of harm. And for a lot of universities, this is important. They're long established, they have histories. Even our disciplines have histories. And so we need to make sure that these initiatives are being really given the opportunity to thrive and to succeed. Again, I'm wrapping up towards the end now, so I'm just going to take a moment to say that this conversation is not specific to one discipline. It's not about politics or about humanities. It's about our society and the way that we as people in society are conditioned. We are trying to undo a systematic harm, which can be found in all of these different areas and all of these different disciplines. To pluck one out the air let's talk about medical treatment and medicine and the conversations in public discourse at the moment about the fact that Black women in childbirth are 5 times more likely to die in something that is so common and so casual. Well, maybe not casual, quite painful, but something that happens frequently. So how do we engage with those conversations? If science responds by saying, well, this isn't a science issue, then we can keep perpetuating this inequality by failing to target it with the new scientists that are being formed, created, that are growing and thinking in our university spaces. So these disciplines are in no way an exhaustive list, but I just want to highlight the fact that as it stands, as it stands currently, it's far more difficult for Black women to upload photos for digital passport applications in the UK. Again, what does that mean in the COVID context when a lot of our fundamental operations as society are digitized? So it's about us taking the moment to recognize that there are issues here that need to be solved, and they need to be solved at the root. And if we refuse to solve them at the root, we'll only be treating the symptoms and not addressing the cause. So, this work is incredibly difficult. It's not easy, but we do have the opportunity to make our world better every single day. One of my favorite quotes says, "We will do harm, now what?" Our focus isn't just on our mistakes, but it's about how we've learned from those mistakes and how we aim to constructively move forward to correct them. So, some key takeaways. 1, decolonizing is the process of building a better future by recognizing the past and seeking to heal intergenerational harm. 2, understanding university processes can maximize the success of our student movements. 3, decolonizing requires changes in teaching and learning, research, and in operational processes. This all needs to be underpinned by change in attitude. Lastly, our voices are powerful, and we have the power to make the world better than we found it. It's been an honor spending the afternoon with you all and engaging with some of these debates. I'd now like to hand back to Fadouz and take any questions. I've shared some resources, so if any of these things look interesting, take a quick screenshot and have a look. Everything can be found online. And lastly, here are some of my contact details. That's my website, my LinkedIn, Twitter, and my email address. So if you feel like staying in touch, please do. And I think that's all. I'd now like to hand back to Fadouz. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxine. Thank you so much. This is really, really informative. I must say, so well defined. I mean, to be honest, in our university, we are not so open about decolonization. Sometimes we don't actually realize there is a necessity of doing decolonization. We think always that it's fine, we are doing great, why we need to have it, it's not important. How you will advise our student to start the conversation? Because what I have found in my role is really hard to start a conversation, because most of the time people actually don't realize that there is an importance to talk about it. How you want to advise? I mean, a little bit.
That is a fantastic question, and one that I really struggled with at the beginning when I started doing this work. And I started, as I mentioned, in my law department, and we were engaging with the racial attainment gap in law, and my class was disproportionately people of color, different racialized groups, lots of people from South Asian communities, quite a few people from Black communities, more even, I would say, disproportionately than people from white backgrounds. And a lot of the people who were from white backgrounds were actually international students from other European countries and not necessarily British. And when I started this conversation, I was faced with a lot of backlash, and a lot of people came to me and said, like, Maxine, like, I really like you and I respect you as a person, but I don't want to be involved in this thing. Like, I don't really see it as a me problem. If it's a you problem, that's up to you. And I think what is useful to address that is statistics, because once I realized that my course was disproportionately filled with racial minority groups, but still had an attainment gap where we were underperforming compared to white students, you can't argue that it doesn't affect you if you can see clearly, visually, that it's really happening. And I think that the first thing I had to do was really get that information out there, launch our social media accounts, start talking about it in our social media accounts, ask for space in terms inside of the university context, ask for those 5 minutes at the beginning of lecture to engage with these issues, to show the PowerPoint, because I think once you see that bar chart, it's really hard to contest and people do start to care. It's often not a sense that people don't care, it's that people can't see how it's operating. And that's because, again, like I said, it's baked into the way that universities operate. And so we might not think about it on a day-to-day. And I understand that. And I was making that point about how most of us just want to come, finish. We might be the first in our family to go to university. We want to get a good job. We have other pressures. We have family to care for. We have other responsibilities. But despite all of that, we must be given a fair opportunity to thrive. And in order to do that, we need to remove some of these blocks that we're fighting against, and we don't know that we're fighting against them.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This is really informative, I must say. I got to know so many things we haven't imagined it, especially in the last you shared a book list and some information that people might find it useful. So definitely, I would advise my fellow mates and fellow students to go for reading with this. Thank you so much for your time and for joining with us today. We are really, really grateful to have you with us and really looking forward to work with you.
Fantastic. Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really grateful to have spent this time with you.
Thank you. And thank you everyone whoever joined with us today, and please stay with us on our next Get Clued Up, which is this Friday with our another VP Education, Rabi, and we will talk about the primary teaching in this pandemic. And yeah, keep in touch with us. Thank you.